At this point, we want to turn our attention to two more difficult techniques for data manipulation, or less straightforward routines, which are, however, nevertheless very important in practice, namely how to summarize data and how to make group operations. We directly follow all our elaborations from the previous video on data manipulation. So I'm still in the same script. I'm also using the same data files as before. I'm starting, however, with a slightly adjusted version of the data raw long data set. That's the original data set that you've already encountered. I filtered this data set here to only keep the unemployment data in here. So this is the data set we will be working with right now. And the first thing we want to do is we want to summarize this data set. By this, imagine the situation. You have this data on the two countries. On unemployment, you now want to get the average of the unemployment for all countries over the whole time. So you want to have something like unemp average. And you can do this by starting from this data set, throwing it into the next line by using the pipe. You can summarize it by using the function, summarise. The function summarise works as follows. It's very similar to the function mutate, by the way. You write the name of the variable that you want to create. Let's call it, in our case, unemployment mean. You add the equality sign, and then you write the mathematical operation that you want to perform. In our case, we want to have the mean value of the column value. So to do this, we just call the function mean that you've encountered before. We want to get the mean from the column value, so we just write mean value, and that's it. If we execute this and we look at the resulting data set, we see that this big data set has been squeezed into a very tiny data set, in the data set that only corresponds to one column and one row, and this here is the mean of this column. If you don't believe that, you can also check it by computing this mean outside the data frame. So you might remember that data frames are nothing else as elaborated lists. So we can have a look at the column value by using the double square brackets. So you see here, these are the values in the data frame. And on this, we could use the function mean. And you see that the result here is exactly the same as given here by the call from the function summarise. By the way, a nice function from the dplyr package is the function pull. The function pull extracts a column of a resulting data frame. So in this case, we want to extract the column unemp mean. It pulls it out of the data frame. So in this case, we just get the same number as here. So pull is always useful. If you want to take a data frame, you're actually only interested in one particular descriptive statistic of this data frame, you want to pull it out of it. But that's just as a side note. If you want to summarize the data set using summarise, what you usually get is a reduced data frame with only one column and one row. An alternative way of summarizing this data set, let's call it unemp average v, is to again start with the data set above, but not use the function summarise, but use the function mutate that we've encountered in 4. And let's compute unemp mean again as above. And let's see what happens now if we use the function mutate instead of the function summarise. You now see that the dataset has not been squeezed, in the sense that we still have all the columns and all the rows in the dataset, but there is a new column, unemp mean, and this column has the same value for all observations here. it corresponds to exactly this mean. Now, which one is better, summarize or mean? It depends on what you want to do. So if you're really just interested in the mean, probably summarize is what you want to go for. However, this here is practical if you want to do some further operations. So you might think that we want to compute the mean, and then we want to have like the unemployment deviation, where we want to create a new variable that computes for each year the deviation from the overall mean. So we could now write value minus mean. And now we have here the deviation of this value from the overall mean. Might be interesting to do in some cases. So if you want to summarize data, whether to choose the function summarise or the function mutate depends a little bit on what you want to do. In the previous example, we took this data set here and we computed the mean over the whole sample, meaning that this value here is the mean taking into account observations from 2017 and 2018, as well as for Germany and Greece. Now, suppose you're interested in the mean for Germany and Greece separately. In this case, you need to group the data set and then compute the mean, or any other summary statistics for that matter. So let's have a look at how to do that. The classical way is to take the original data set, to use the pipe, and then to use the function from dplyr called group by. Now, group by, you can give the names of the columns according to which you want to group the data set. So in our case, we want to have one group, namely the group, or want to group according to one variable, namely the variable country. Note that here, as in select, you could also use selection helpers, which you might learn about in a separate video. You can also just write the name of the columns. If you execute this code, you will see that the data set has not been changed internally, but that we now have groups. It's a group data set, meaning that everything you do at this point will take into account the grouping that you've added with the group by function. In our case, there is one group, country, and within that variable country, there are two groups, because the variable country has two different instances, Germany and Greece. That's why two groups. Now, in the next step, we want to summarize this data set by computing the mean. And here, nothing has changed as compared to above. We again use the function summarise, and we say, okay, we want to have unemployment average, say, and that should be the mean of the column value. And if we execute this, you now see that as opposed to the example before, we get a new data set that has now two lines and two columns. The columns correspond to the name of the new columns that you created here. You could also create more than one column here by separating the operations with a comma. But in our case, we only use summarise to compute one new column. So all these columns shine up here. In addition, you have one column that corresponds to each of the groups that you've created. So we only have created one group, country. So we have a column country, and we have here two means, one for Germany and one for Greece. As I said, we could also add additional columns by saying, okay, we also want to have the unemployment, say median. And we use the function median on value. In this case, we would have three columns with a median here, which in our case obviously is the same as the mean. As above, we could also use the function mutate instead of summarise. As you might recall, the syntax is exactly the same. The only difference here is that the function mutate adds new columns as opposed to squeeze or summarize the whole data set. In both cases, however, we have grouped the data set according to the country. We could also group the data set according to the year, but we decided to group according to the country. Then you just need to adjust what you've done, what you've added here in the group by function. You will also see, however, that the resulting data set still is grouped. That might or might not be a problem, but if you then want to make operations that do not use the groups as before, then you need to add the function dplyr ungroup. If you do this, you now have a clean data set without groups, but with a grouped columns with a group mean and group median added to it. If you do it by the function summarise, the grouping will be removed by default if you have one group. Otherwise, you could use this argument groups and write here drop. This basically removes, makes sure that the grouping is removed, and I usually recommend you to add this additional argument to make sure that the data set that you create in the very end does not contain groups anymore. It might contain the grouped averages or the group means or whatever, medians, but it shouldn't contain the groups. So make sure that something like this does not occur in the final data set, because this could be confusing if you then add additional operations. Now, again, the use of the function group by in combination with the pipe makes the whole thing easy to read. However, some people found this to be quite clumsy, because we compute these group-based summary statistics very frequently. So people were wondering why we need this extra line where we need to group the data set, which is why now there has been additional functionality added to functions such as summarise or mutate. Can use the function summarise, use exactly the same syntax as before, can add this optional argument by, and here you just write the name of the variables accordingly you want to group by, so in our case country, and if you execute this, get the same result as you received here. So if the results are the same, just the rounding is different. It's just shorter because you have this optional argument by. You can use the argument by also for mutate. So mutate also features this optional argument by. It is, however, a rather new feature, so not many people might know about it. And there are also instances where you need to group a data set for other further operations. So I think it's very important that you keep in mind that this function dplyr group by exists, and that you can undo the grouping by dplyr ungroup. Whether you use it when writing, when computing summary statistics, or when adding group-based variables by using mutate and the by argument, that is up to you. Both ways work, but I think it's important to keep in mind that both exist, because this use of the .by argument is rather new. In any case, you can also group data sets with more than one grouping variable, which in our case here doesn't make so much sense, because if we added a second grouping variable, in our case maybe here year, you might figure out that the averages that you compute are the same as the actual values. Why? Because if you group by both country and year, you only have one value left. But if you are working with more complex data sets, grouping by more than one variable could be an option and could be important. good thing is it doesn't change anything of the in the syntax. Once you understand the basic idea of how to group a data set and compute summary statistics, you're actually good to go. And as before, whether you use summarize or mutate depends entirely on what you want to achieve with your data set. Summarize basically collapses the data set and only provides you with a summary. Mutate adds a new column to the data set that you can then use for further processing.